Father Ken, you want to start with some introductory remarks, and then I will begin the PowerPoint at your direction.
Thank you, Dave. Good evening, everybody. Hope you're well. And what seems like today, at least here, it felt like the first day of fall. It was the first day that I kind of felt like, oh yeah, the seasons are changing. But I hope you're all well and enjoying life. Dave, if you'd go to the first slide.
I will. 1 second. Okay.
Okay, so what we're going to do in 4 sessions is tonight, I'm going to make some introductory remarks to the whole idea of Catholic social thought. And then we'll spend most of our time talking about one half of what I usually refer to as the foundations of Catholic social thought. And that is, it all comes down to the way you use and understand the human person. It was Aristotle, long before the Christian era, who made the comment that unless you get your view of the human person right, you'll almost always get your view of politics wrong. That it's really important to have a proper understanding of what it means to be a human person. And then we can think about what it means to be a good human being. That will help us think clearly about what it means to be a good society and to practice good politics. So we're going to spend some time today talking about half of that message of what it means to be a human person, and that is that the human person is sacred. And I'll try and draw out some of the implications that Catholic social teaching takes from that claim that the human person is sacred. Then next week, we're going to deal with the other half of the statement about the human person, and that is that the human person is deeply and innately social. And we'll spend time next week drawing out the implications of what it means to understand ourselves as social beings, or as Aristotle used to use the term, that we are inevitably political beings. Politics, in the root sense of the word, referring to the Greek city-state, the polis, that human beings are meant to be in society with others. And we'll talk about that next week and the implications of that. Then in week 3, we'll take up the question of what do we understand, or what ought we to expect about the role of the church in society and in the world. What can we reasonably ask of the institution of the church in terms of its role and its activity in the world? And then we'll end up our final session. We'll move not just from the church, but now think about the role of the individual Catholic in the world, and specifically what place for individual believers as well as the community of believers in the realm of politics. So that's what we're going to do over the next 4 weeks, dealing with first an understanding of the human person and the implications one draws from that in Catholic social teaching, and then talk specifically about the role of the church in public life, and then end up with talking about not only the church, but also the individual in public life. Okay? So that's, in a nutshell, what we'll be covering in the next few weeks. So let me begin with some introductory remarks. Dave, if you'd go to the next slide, please. Each one of us has a way of thinking about life. And what I mean by that is that none of us simply lives a life. None of us simply has experience, plain and simple. You and I are always interpreting our experience, always trying to make sense of the reality that we encounter. We develop a method for doing that. It may be somewhat formal and reflected upon. It may just be gut instincts that we operate from. But we're always going on and interpreting facts and trying to find the meaning in facts. We're never satisfied simply with raw facts. So think of your newspaper. Think of the news shows that we watch or that we read or listen to, and we find out certain facts. There's now fighting going on in northern Lebanon as well as in Gaza. Hostilities between Hezbollah and Israel. There's been flooding in Central Europe. There's a hurricane coming up through the Caribbean into Southeast United States. What the most recent polls are saying about the race between Harris and Trump. The Federal Reserve just cut interest rates. And we all know those things or hear those facts, but we're not satisfied just with that. We all ask ourselves, well, what does it mean? The facts are not enough. So we read columnists, we listen to talk shows, we converse with our friends. All of this helps us to put the facts into some sort of perspective. It gives us the ability to formulate opinions about those facts. The point is that you and I are always interpreting. We're always sorting out, seeking to make sense of, and to draw lessons from our experience. And when we do that, we start out from a perspective, a characteristic way that each of us has for interpreting reality. Now, of course, there's different perspectives on life. I have mine, you have yours, and our perspectives are different from other people's. People have experiences similar to ours, but they interpret the meaning of the experience differently. Isn't it true that sometimes we find ourselves in an argument with someone, and after much debate, it ends up with words similar to, well, that's just how I see it. What is at controversy is often not necessarily the facts of the case, but rather the way the facts are being viewed. You can see in that the importance of vision. How you see things is crucial for how you interpret reality. And how you interpret reality will shape how you and I respond to reality. Is that stranger over there across the room a potential friend or an enemy? A lot depends on the way I see it. Is that person with a question at the end of the evening a fellow seeker of truth with an honest question? Or is it someone trying to push their views over on the rest of us? That judgment's going to affect our demeanor and our response. I think what you're going to find in Catholic social teaching is a certain vision, a worldview that is distinct from other social perspectives like capitalism, socialism, liberalism, conservatism. So by worldview, I mean a set of assumptions or convictions that provide each of us with a perspective on how we interpret our reality. Catholic social thought derives from a vision that if we had more time, and I'm not going to get into this, but I could show that it's different than, say, how Protestants think about the world, or Buddhists, or Marxists, or others. What we are talking about is not so much a matter of Catholic doctrine, but rather what might be called the Catholic imagination, the way we think about things and imagine things to be. There's a several background assumptions that I think are part of the Catholic imagination. One, there is an optimism about the human situation, a belief that human beings are, on the whole, more good than bad. Second, that individuals live in communities that do not limit their freedom, but rather enhance freedom. The existence of others in our lives and the relationships we have with other people do not bind us as much as they liberate us. They allow us to be more truly ourselves. A third assumption in the Catholic imagination is that there is an importance to being rooted. That is, to have a sense of tradition, a sense of historical ties, a sense of local community. How often in talking with people and trying to explain how we see things, we at some point say, well, let me tell you where I'm coming from on this. That's to show and to reveal that we think our past experience, our biographies, our tradition all has a role in explaining why do I think the way I do. And finally, I'm going to suggest to you that the Catholic worldview also believes in what I'm going to call mediation. What I mean by that is that other people mediate to us and help us to understand values, certain causality, a certain way of looking at life comes to us through our encounters with other people. Initially, of course, our families. But then as we grow, it moves out beyond our immediate family to circles of friendship, to communal ties. It may be our local parish. It may be our place of work. It may be the wider society, the city in which we live, or the region where we live. Gradually, that mediation gets broader and broader. And sometimes figures that were very important in mediating reality to us one time, our immediate family, as we get older, that may become relatively unimportant as we grow older. But all these things help to shape the way that Catholic social teaching approaches social issues. What I'm going to call the deep theory of Catholic social teaching, that is the background horizon of Catholic social teaching, is communitarianism. That is, by communitarianism, I mean that the accent mark falls on the relational or communal context. We tend to view things through a communal lens rather than an individualistic lens. And so attention is given in Catholic social thought to the responsibilities that come with communal living, to the conditions and the elements that make for good communal life rather than bad communal life. Hundreds of years of teaching have formulated a basic vision of being created in God's image, which means that you and I are created with dignity, and we find fulfillment in a community that respects us, cares for us, loves us. The more formal teaching that we're going to talk about really articulates a vision that already exists in our Catholic imaginations, that you and I are sacred and social. And standing behind that commitment to the fact that human beings are sacred and possess a certain dignity are two key theological doctrines. The first is the Church's belief and teaching about creation, and the second is our faith in the incarnation, that God became human. Catholics believe that all of creation comes from God and that the creature reflects the creator. This is most dramatically seen in the belief that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. Human beings are creatures of dignity and worth, not because we merit this or due to any achievement on our part, but we believe we are creatures of dignity because we are made in the image of God. Catholic teaching asserts that each human person is invested with a dignity that cannot be denied. It can be violated, but it can't be erased. It's like the biblical image of the potter, and you can know the potter if you examine the pottery. So too, the earthen vessels which we are can reveal something of the loving potter who created us. That belief in the importance of creation by a loving God is further underscored by the second teaching about the incarnation. What Jesus of Nazareth reveals, among other things, is that there is something within the mystery of the human person that is so open to the divine that in the human person of Jesus, the creator and the creature could meet and become united. That you and I, as human beings, are so constituted that the human is capable of receiving the infinite. It's a marvelous claim about our humanity. When God decided to become something other than God, God wound up looking like you and me. God did not become a star. God did not become a rock or a tree or any other living thing. God became human. Coupled with that teaching about human dignity is the claim about human sociality or human relationality. We're going to talk more about that next week, but just let me say a word about it here. For Catholic social teaching, the dignity of the human is only realized in the context of community. That is, the very aim of human life, the purpose of our existence, is to enter into communion with others. You and I are made for each other. We're created in order to give ourselves away to the other. You and I achieve our truest self when we fall in love. We cannot be truly human apart from being in relationship. After all, the God in whose image we are created is Trinitarian, not Unitarian. So behind the Catholic conviction about human relationality is the belief in the Trinity. Now, we've all been around Catholicism long enough to know that for too many Catholics, this is an abstract belief that doesn't mean much. Some of the worst sermons and homilies I've ever heard take place on Trinity Sunday every year. The very nature of God is loving communion. That's the lesson of the Trinity. So to be made in the image and likeness of that kind of God, who is within God's very self, a loving communion of Father, Son, and Spirit. So to be made in the image of that kind of God means that you and I are made to enter into community. Like the Father, Son, and Spirit within the life of the Trinity, you and I are made in order to give ourselves away, to receive the gift of others. And all of this is for us to become more authentically who we are meant to be. The achievement of becoming genuinely human is never an isolated pursuit, but rather it's the radically communal experience of being loved and loving others. You and I are most human when we are in love, when we give of ourselves, and when we're filled up by the self-gift of others to us. That's why marriage is a sacrament. That's why parenting is a special vocation. And that's why friendship should get much more attention than it does from the church. Because these are all expressive of the very nature of persons, the persons we're meant to be, persons who live in loving relationship with God and with others. So if God is truly Trinitarian, if within the very nature of God there is the loving communion of Father, Son, and Spirit, then the emphasis for human beings made in the image of such a God has to be on solidarity and community rather than individualism and isolation. Now, the church's social teaching is simply the effort to spell out as best we can the political, economic, social, and cultural implications of those two claims about human beings, that we are creatures of dignity and worth, we're sacred, and that we are creatures made for community and relationship. We are social. Those implications that human beings are sacred and social were not discovered all at once, but the history of Catholic social teaching is a story of how the community of faith has, over the course of ages, come to understand and articulate what is implied by a commitment to human dignity and human relationality. Nothing explains the tradition of Catholic social teaching better than the fact that it is a tradition founded upon the conviction that the human person is sacred and social. All the papal encyclicals, all the conciliar decrees, all the pastoral letters of the American bishops can be traced back to that conviction. The human person is sacred and social. Dave, if we could go to the next slide, please. So now let me try and spell out a few of these key implications in the time we have left for the human person as sacred. We'll deal with the human person as social next week. So the first thing we want to say about this dignity that you and I have by being sacred and made in the image of God is that our dignity is inherent. It's not something external to us. Our dignity does not rest upon our achievements. It doesn't rest upon our education. It doesn't rest upon our status in a group. It doesn't rest upon the size of our bank account or the skills that we have or the talents we possess. Our dignity belongs to us simply because we are made in God's image. And as such, you can never give away your dignity. You can never sacrifice your dignity. It can't be taken from us. It can be violated, but it cannot be erased. One of the great signs of our dignity is that you and I are free. At Vatican II, it was stated, and we'll talk about this in 2 weeks from now, that one of the great signs of human dignity is that human beings are free. Not free in the sense of simply that we can choose between wearing a blue shirt or a green shirt, but free in the sense that you and I are capable of making something of ourselves. The human project that begins as we leave our mother's womb and come into the world, that's a project of you and I fashioning and creating ourselves over the ensuing months and years and decades. We do this interacting with the environment around us, the people around us. But there still is a role of you and I fashioning a self, you and I creating our identity. The importance of this and this understanding this is one of the impacts that liberalism had on the Catholic tradition. What I mean by liberalism here is not the way we talk about it here in America. Harris is liberal, Trump's conservative. That's not what I mean by it. I'm referring to liberalism in the classic sense of the term, that is, as a philosophy of life that emphasizes personal freedom and personal liberties. So think about our Declaration of Independence, where it's claimed that you and I have rights to life, liberty, and happiness. Jefferson used that third term, happiness. He was taking this material from the English philosopher John Locke, writing 100 years before. And Locke talked about life, liberty, and property. And what was meant was Locke was saying there are certain freedoms, certain liberties that every Englishman had at the time. And he was talking about men here, English men. He said that every Englishman had a right to life, that no monarch could simply arbitrarily or through personal edict take the life of another. We had a right to liberty. We could not be arbitrarily arrested or detained without good cause, and that we had a right to property, that no government could seize our property or make the holding of property so onerous that most of us couldn't afford to have property. That was the beginning of liberalism, carving out space that an individual said, government can do some things, but there are some things that are off limits for a government. Government has no right to override the right to life, liberty, and property of a citizen. That mindset has had great influence, not only here in America, because really Americans were all liberals, all right? If we were studying the history of liberalism, this comment would make more sense to you. But I would suggest that the real difference in America is not between liberal and conservative. We're all liberal. The difference is, are you a 20th century liberal or a 19th century liberal? That is, are you a liberal who thinks government is a threat to our freedom? If so, you're a 19th century liberal. Or do you think private economic power is the great threat to the individual? If you think it's that, then you're a 20th century liberal. Most Americans are liberal in that they believe the task is to preserve and protect and promote individual freedoms. Where we differ is, what's the great threat to that freedom? Unlimited state power or unlimited corporate economic power? And who you think the bogeyman is will largely determine whether you are a Republican or a Democrat. But Republicans and Democrats have arguments in this country around a bandwidth that's very narrow. We have no genuine socialist tradition in this country. We have no genuine Burkean conservatism in this country. We have no anarchic tradition in this country or Marxist tradition in this country. Almost all Americans are liberals of one stripe or another. A second part of this claim of equal dignity, human dignity, is that it's equal. I do not have more or less dignity than you. We are all creatures of a loving God. God has bestowed dignity on all of us. This is the important point about our dignity is owing to God's creating of us. It's not owing to our skills or our abilities or our educational backgrounds or our financial success. There's clearly inequalities in those areas. And if we rested our dignity on those areas, we could make a case that some people have greater dignity than others. But in the Catholic tradition, dignity is equal. All human beings possess dignity because all human beings are created in the image of God. Now, the implications of this, as you're well aware, only get unpacked over time. There was a period of time when we were talking about this, all men are created equal, in the words of the Declaration of Independence in this country. It took time in this country to unpack that men was not a gendered term in the way it should be used. It was really meant to be referring to humankind. And it took time for us to realize that all men and women are equal in dignity. It also was originally understood that it was all white men who were equal. And it's taken time and history for us to unpack the meaning of that term to realize that the all people includes people of different races and cultures and backgrounds. So it takes time sometimes for us to understand things that we say. And you know this as well as I do. Any of us, or any of you who've gone through a long and successful marriage know it's taken time for you to understand what you really meant when you said, I do. It wasn't immediately obvious up there on the altar the day you said it. But over the course of your lives, the meaning of that expression, I do, the meaning of the vows you took got unpacked. And you began to see implications to that commitment that only became clear and obvious as time went on. The same thing is true in terms of the American Constitution. The same thing is true in terms of Catholic professions of Catholic social teaching. We sometimes say more than we understand, and it takes a while, generations even, for us to begin to understand the full meaning of what we have earlier professed. So what we see here is the impact of social charity, the works that we've done of compassion and caring and for other people. Gradually, we began to understand the dignity of the poor, the dignity of the marginalized, the dignity of the disabled, the dignity of people that the rest of society may have at times dismissed or thought little of, but gradually our faith community began to understand that all people of all backgrounds, with all sorts of historical limitations or conditions, we're all still equal in dignity. It took time to get there. And as we know, we're still trying to attain and understand what that equality really means and the implications of that equality for people in the life of the church. But what I think we can say is that this commitment to human dignity and the equality of persons means that it at least has taught us, it has taught us at least the fact that there is a flaw beneath which we should never let anybody fall. There are certain social conditions that we must always secure for everybody. Some of those conditions may be economic in terms of basic nutrition, hydration, shelter, access to medical care, and the like. No one should simply be bereft of these things. But also, the flaw is there in terms of certain conditions of communal life. No one should live in a community that tortures them or denigrates them or enslaves them, that there are conditions of social status that no one should be allowed to fall beneath as well. So, at least in this sense, there is what I'm going to call relative egalitarianism. It's not suggesting that we are equal in everything, in every way, but it does suggest that a decent community establishes a floor beneath which it never lets anyone sink, because to do so is to effectively deny their dignity as creatures of a loving God. One of the debates we can have about this relative egalitarianism is not only does it secure a floor beneath which we ought not to let anybody fall, we can get into a really interesting debate about, is there a ceiling above which we ought not let anybody rise? That at some point, does too much of some things actually undermine the dignity of a person? You can talk more about that next week. A second aspect of this human dignity that Catholic social tradition has begun to unpack over the course of time is that human rights become one of the chief ways whereby we secure and protect human dignity. Now, within the history of human rights, broadly speaking, we could say that there have been, coming down into the 20th century, there were two traditions of human rights. On the one hand, you had the liberal tradition, which I've alluded to already, people like John Locke, and then through Locke and his influence on people like Jefferson, Adams, and others, we've had the impact of the liberal tradition in America, which tends to talk about human rights as civil and political liberties: freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of travel, freedoms like that. Civil and political immunities, we might say, that protect the individual from an overbearing state. On the other hand, there's another tradition that comes out of the Marxist background. And in Marxism, the talk about human rights tends to be social and economic goods, that everyone, to protect people's dignity, everyone should be guaranteed a decent job. Everyone should be guaranteed basic food and drink and shelter and the like. That the rights that really mattered are social and economic goods that protect a person's physical, material well-being. What's interesting is when the Catholic Church finally and officially endorses the language of human rights, and I think the case can be made and has been made, that this happens with John the 23rd back in 1963 with his encyclical letter, Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth. In that encyclical, John the 23rd, for the first time in the Catholic tradition, enunciates all the various rights, human rights, that the Catholic Church endorses. And what's interesting is the Catholic Church's approach here is neither siding with the liberal tradition of civil and political liberties or the Marxist tradition of social and economic liberties, but rather it unites these. The Catholic tradition's viewpoint on human rights looks very much like, almost exactly, as the UN Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. That is, it combines the liberal and Marxist traditions to say human beings deserve and must have protected both basic civil and political liberties and social and economic goods. And so within Catholicism, there is this tendency to talk about not only rights to certain freedoms, but also certain goods and because of the emphasis on community and relationality in the Catholic understanding of human dignity, there's also emphasis on relationships, that there are certain basic rights that protect and promote human relationships, which should be secured for people. The most recent document, I think, or most recent encyclical anyway, we could talk about in Catholic social teaching was Pope Francis's recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Brothers of Us All. And in there, Francis makes an interesting little point. He talks at one point in the document about the French Revolution. And you may recall from your European history classes or whatever, the French Revolution's, the slogan was Fraternité, Égalité, Liberté. Fraternity, equality, liberty. And Francis says that when you look at the history of politics in our world, we've had all kinds of political movements that stress liberty, right? As we talked about already, liberalism, right? We've also had traditions that stressed equality, socialist and Marxist traditions, égalité. But he says what we've yet to have in our politics is a genuine emphasis on fraternité, on fraternity, on relationality, on building community. And Francis,
we're getting into the 5-minute warning time.
Okay, and Francis suggests this is the real task of contemporary politics, to create a politics of community, fraternity, solidarity. Let me just close this section by saying then that this emphasis on human rights was picked up after John the 23rd by Paul VI, but especially by John Paul II. And I'll just say this. John Paul wants to be, one of the titles he gives himself as Pope. It's one of the advantages of being Pope. You can give yourself your own titles. He called himself the universal pastor. And what he meant by that was he saw part of his role as Pope as going around the world and speaking to people in their own regions and locales. So as you know, no Pope has ever traveled as much as John Paul II traveled in terms of his global engagement. And the question comes up, how can a Pope give a unified message to such a pluralistic situation as our present world? Given the vast diversity of cultures and ways of life, how can you speak a word that makes sense to somebody in Brazil, in Thailand, in Korea, in Canada, in Kenya? How can we do this? And what Francis hit on was the language of human rights. And so what you find is so often when John Paul II traveled around the world, he talked about human rights, because what he said, while there is legitimate diversity, politically, economically, culturally, no matter what region of the world you're in, no matter what culture you live in, no matter what the political or economic system that you live in, it should be a society that respects the rights of a person. No society, no political or economic ideology that denies the basic rights, human rights of a person is acceptable, because that's to undercut the rights and the dignity of all persons. I'll end with this. At the same time, and we go to the next slide, Dave. At the same time, as important as rights language is, we need more than rights, because the things that really matter in life are relationships. And the language of rights doesn't really capture relationships. To talk about, I have a right to love, or I have a right to forgiveness, or I have a right to compassion, it doesn't make sense, right? These are things which are either freely given or they're not. And what we need is communities that embody love, friendship, forgiveness, compassion. What Paul VI talked about as the task of designing a civilization of love. In Catholic social teaching, the key word after Paul and under John Paul II and with Francis becomes this word solidarity. That it's not a vague feeling of compassion, it's a commitment to the well-being of the other. And you and I need rights, but we need more than rights to really experience our dignity. We need love, friendship, forgiveness, compassion. There's one final thing there, human development. I can bring that in next week when we talk. So let me stop here and simply suggest that in Catholic teaching, if you understand where I'm going with this, the way the Catholic social tradition explains itself, it's not a set of rules or norms that are imposed from without that says, here's something God commands, or here's something a government demands, or whatever it may be. Rather, good human morality, helping human beings to become truly creatures of dignity and worth, that's not something that comes imposed from without. It's the logic of being a human person. To be a human person requires the sorts of things we've been talking about so far. So that morality doesn't come from outside us, it flows out from within us. It's what is it that will make your life and my life a genuinely authentic life? How do you and I become more truly and genuinely human? And the Catholic social tradition suggests that for that to happen, we have to respect the nature of human dignity. We have to see and protect and promote human rights as expressions of human dignity. And we have to recognize that even as important as those rights are, they're not enough. We need more than rights language. We need the experience of genuine solidarity between peoples. So with that in mind, let me pose a question. And Dave, if you would go to that next to last slide. I simply pose a question for you to think about in the small groups. And that is, if you were to describe your moral vision, how would you describe your way of understanding the moral life? What really matters? What is of value? What are the priorities in your moral vision? And do you see the way you talk about the moral life? Is it similar to Catholic social teaching, or is it different? And if so, in what ways? That might be a way for us to start the conversation in our groups tonight.
Welcome back. I think everyone is back now. And I'm going to start. Let's see. Okay. I'm going to start by opening up the chat, and we'll go through those. And then if we have some more time, others can join us in their comments. So we are going to be shared the slides. The slides will be sent out probably tomorrow to the distribution list. So you will get the slides. If you're not on the distribution list, let me know and I can send you the slides. Okay. Other people have other comments about any questions about that came up in the. I looked at the other ones; they're not really germane to the topics. So there's people have other things that they would like to add. They can unmute yourself and ask your questions or make your comments.
I just had a thought at the end of our group that the sequence of the 4 weeks that Father Ken is going to deliver ends with the political. And it felt like the political is so messed up that it really burdens the individual and makes the moral dilemma so overwhelming for the individual to react in a messed up political situation.
Yeah, I think that's true. My sense is that you know, if we come to the political with the proper understanding of what we expect our faith tradition to offer us, it's not that this faith tradition is going to, remove the responsibility that each one of us has to make the conscientious decisions that we make when we make political choices. So, I mean, I can tell you in advance, I'm not going to be saying, this is the Catholic or this is the Christian political platform or, candidate or something like that. I think it's that each of us comes with this kind of, worldview. And if we understand what goes into the formulation of kind of the Catholic worldview, then at least we can say, okay, within that worldview, how do you bring that from very general, comments down to making specific choices? Those things are never easy to do, and we ought not expect, and in fact, I would really actively resist any church leader thinking that they usurp that role of telling us what to do on the practical matters of choice. I think there's a rightful role for discernment by each individual, as honestly as they can, to say, on balance, no candidate is simply my candidate on every score. No party is, no platform is, but on balance, I make decisions and I discern this is, you could look at it as, negatively, the lesser of two evils, or you can look at it more positively. This option, I think, secures more of the good that I think we need to promote than the other options do. But I think there is, even in the most polarized climates, and we are in a very polarized climate, I think one of the virtues we really need is intellectual humility. I mean, we all know about humility in terms of people willing to make themselves servants of others or willing to acknowledge their own weaknesses or failures or not be too boastful about their accomplishments. But by intellectual humility, I mean a certain acknowledgement that none of us get certitude in this world. You know, life is not like a Euclidean theorem in math. You don't get certitude in this world, and we all have to recognize that. We put our money down and place our bets here or there, but we all should do that with some genuine modesty about how certain am I that I'm correct or that I'm making the right decision. And it seems to me that's what's really lacking right now in our present climate. So many people are unwilling to say that my perspective is just that. It's a perspective. I'm not seeing all of reality. I'm seeing it from a certain stance or position. And I might look at it differently were I in another position. And so that's, I think, what I'm going to try and do is clarify what is stance that Catholic social tradition has and recognize that that tradition is, as much as I believe in it and accept it and work with it and have my entire life worked with it professionally, uh, it's a take on reality. It's not reality. None of us gets reality whole and entire. We all get it from a certain perspective, a certain stance. There's a saying that's popular in Brazil. I forget the Portuguese for it, but the saying is basically where you stand depends upon where you sit, and that is, someone like me at my age, with a certain level of security and comfort in terms of material needs, with a wide swath of fellow Franciscans who are very supportive and gracious to me. I'm in a very privileged position compared to somebody who is quite ill, who is struggling to, make medical bills, who is perhaps basically isolated, living in an apartment that they don't get out of very much. That person's going to have a different take on what are the issues and what are the needs than someone who lives in the kind of privileged setting that I'm living in on this campus that's like a botanical garden most of the time, and where I don't worry about will there be food on the table when I go downstairs. Those kinds of things put me in a different place than somebody else, and so to recognize that I have to really try as best I can imaginatively to get out of my skin and see the world from the perspective of other people in very different situations. I think we all need to do that to some extent. And those of us who have some privileges really need to do that to try to understand how the world looks to people who are living much more precariously than I do.
Okay, any other comments at this point? Okay, I think we are all set for tonight. If there are any issues, technical issues or anything like that, please email me things I got one from that was mentioned, and I can give a warning next time to the end of the breakout rooms. I will do that so people get a heads up. If there are any technical problems or things like that, let me know, and I'm going to try to make sure things run a little more smoothly on some things. Otherwise, we'll be together next week at same time, same place here at 7 p.m. next Wednesday for the second session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
Thank
everyone
you.
stay-
Thank you.
Thanks, Father.